Well, greetings and welcome, and on behalf of the entire DomPrep staff of over 18,000 readers and registered members worldwide, welcome to another DomPrep executive briefing held here at Harvard University's Faculty Club. I'm Marty Masuk, the publisher of DomPrep Journal, DomesticPreparedness.com, and the DPJ Weekly Brief, and I thank you all for attending. As is the tradition, today's purpose is to present key findings from a survey conducted on biological detection, more specifically, advancing technology in biological surveillance and detection. A report that will include today's presentations will be published and distributed to DomPrep's audience. As noted, the topic today is advancing technology in biosurveillance detection. So as we go through today's agenda, let's look beyond the obvious and ask ourselves what tools are required for authorities in local, state, and at the federal level to make good decisions. So having said that, now with the presentations, Dr. Runge, the podium is yours.
The genesis of this discussion really came about from a discussion that Marty and I had in the wake of the buzz that currently exists around biological detection for dealing with the terrorist threat of biologicals. What I'd like to do is not talk about BioWatch per se, but talk more about biological detection and the ongoing requirement that we have to protect the country. I'm going to start with a quote from General Phil Russell, who many of you know as one of the nation's foremost biological terrorism experts, who said, "Anybody who can read can make a biological weapon." This sort of distributed threat creates a real conundrum for the United States to protect itself. Going back to the origins of Homeland Security Presidential Directive Number 10 for biological defense. And it was written by a team of people, and I think they got it exactly right. We can quibble with the content of these pillars, but there are 4 pillars. It's threat awareness, it's the intelligence, it's the understanding the biological organisms. The second pillar is protection and prevention. It's guarding our infrastructure, and it's protecting the population against the consequences of these organisms. The third is surveillance and detection, which is what we're here to talk about today. And the fourth is response and recovery. Pardon my seemingly political bias here, but unfortunately very little discussion is created now around HSPD 10, but the strategy is still there. DHS still uses the strategy. The strategy is still very much in people's minds, and it actually makes great sense. We can't manage this problem without attention to each of those pillars.
As was just mentioned, we thought this morning that as we discuss the next generations of technology that might be applied to the BioWatch program, it might be useful to step back for a moment and consider why we have the BioWatch system that we have today. And my purpose really isn't to give a history lesson, but rather kind of first understand what the origins are of the system. And then secondly, and probably more importantly, ask some fundamental questions about whether this is the same system we need going forward. Now, I've spent a fair amount of my time in 35 years in the military designing and developing and applying technology to solve a variety of problems. The most fundamental thing I probably learned from all of that is if you're going to solve a problem, you better first understand what the problem is. And just as importantly, have a realistic assessment of the expected outcomes from your solution. As we look at the next generation of sensors, I believe it raises some important questions. First, are we developing a system against a very specific high consequence but low probability threat? Or are we developing a capability based on what we believe is the current and future threat? Are we simply improving on the existing system, the next best thing? Or do we relook the threat and determine what capability best addresses that threat? Secondly, assuming that the environmental sensors remain a critical part of an early warning system, do we have the right mix and density of sensors, and are they in the right places? Third, are these sensors integrated into a truly layered and integrated biological defense system that tips and cues among sensors, diagnostic labs, and public health authorities? Finally, and perhaps most importantly, what's the expected outcome from this capability? How much early warning should we expect? What kind of actionable information do we want from the system to be able to tell us and decision makers, and to what degree of confidence? I can't say I've got good answers to these questions. What I do know from years of experience is that we need to ensure that we are trying to solve the right problem, that we are applying technology based on a thorough understanding of the problem, and that we manage outcome expectations.
I have a lot of opinions on this, and my opinions are based on my responsibility that I take very seriously in putting people into harm's way at the ground level. We have no strategy in the United States for bioterrorism. We have had a lot of academic discussion, a lot of papers, a lot of presidential decisions, orders, research, and equipment put forward. And actually, all of the failings have been mentioned. Equipment has been designed and deployed without really understanding what we'll do with the information. There are some profound errors in the assumption of the knowledge and capabilities of the responders. I would ask that we back up and not focus simply on the technology, but look at what, through this process that we spent $14 million on, we came up with an onion. It is the layers of response. We need to have technology that is validated, that is layered, so that in the small communities, as well as in the large communities or the financially robust programs such as my own, there is an ability to make some immediate decisions. Now, what are those decisions? Those decisions are not necessarily to hand out antibiotics. Those decisions may be to simply hold an area until further assistance and analysis can come. But those decisions need to be based upon technologies or systems or processes that are agreed upon and validated. We also have to have, I believe, a national training program so that we have a consistent level of knowledge of what the operator is and what that operator's competency is. But simply to say that if we fail to develop a strategy that incorporates the real world of what we are facing, regardless of the technology, we will fail. And we will fail worse than we failed in 2001 because we have spent, I believe the number I last read was $8 billion just on white powders in this country. $8 billion. The American people, if they find that we cannot respond to this effectively, will immediately lose confidence in us. And if this biological event is a terrorist act, the terrorists will have a huge victory because we will not regain that confidence back.
So from my vantage point, what do I think we need? We need to go back and redo the risk and vulnerability assessments based on the as-is. The updated threat assessment, just mentioned that a little bit. There's also debate in the community as to whether we're now spending too much time on looking at emerging threats when we haven't solved the problems with the known threats. I think going back to some of the basics there as well would be prudent. We could field systems right now that would be very, very effective against anthrax, but we've got this broad library we want to try to address, as well as emerging threats. So sometimes going back to basics makes sense, and you can field systems against what some people would consider the most logical and probable threat. I believe, as we did in my nuclear hat, develop a biodefense architecture. Right now we have a program-driven strategy where BioWatch is kind of at the centroid of everything, but we don't really have an architecture that would define capabilities needed, what the desired end state should be. What are our objectives? What are the desired end states that we need to get to in biodefense? As part of that, you've really got to bring the federal, state, and local roles and responsibilities into perspective. I think we need to develop a systems approach to biodefense, as I've already mentioned. So what you need to do is you need to start actually doing cost-benefit analysis around these various components of the framework. There is no measure in how we're improving biodefense across the board without a framework like this where every one of the federal entities would have a role. To get back to basics, we need a rigorous requirements development process. It should be operationally focused, not program-driven. BioWatch was a program looking for a sponsor. That's the wrong way to go about it, and we are where we are. DHS needs to do what DoD has done for many years, and is account for a spiral development process. Try not to make the detector the perfect thing for all threats all at once. You'll never get there. It's an impossible task.
I'm presenting something a little bit different today than I think that you've seen before, and I'm coming at this from a little bit different perspective. I do not have a background in the biodefense arena. My background and expertise is actually in decision science. Actually, if you look at the field I studied, is engineering systems. So, as Vail just mentioned, we need to take the systems approach. This is a perspective where you try to look at the system in the large, to look at all the factors that contribute ultimately to your goal, many of which you may have not considered before. An important part of decision science is understanding best how do all these pieces come together in some fundamental way that allows you to make an intelligent decision factoring in all the different pieces of the system. What are ways that we can best communicate a couple different things. One, importance of timing in the process of decision making, not the technology, but the process. And second, the location of the response. So, part of this is on the ground, the thinking being, because this is not like a bomb, where you have that clear 5-mile radius of here's where people are affected, there's a delay in time, and people move over time to understand where do you need to respond. So those are the two things we tried to address by creating a tool which is really for communication. So this is really designed for people to sit down and test their assumptions. What if we could redesign the process to make a better decision, faster? And so you can come up with different numbers, plug that in, and rerun it and see how does this compare to the results we have. So you can really get a trade-off in the number of lives per hour.
That leadership in and of itself would be a problem, and that leadership during periods of preparedness, how do we create unity of government? And then leadership in the moment of response would be a critical factor. And so that meeting concluded with a commitment on the part of Harvard University to those people who were in attendance that we would join you in the steep learning curve on preparedness and response leadership. The other piece is we decided not to throw up the body of leadership literature and say what's relevant here. We decided to put that off to the side and to watch leaders in the field and interview leaders in the field and understand from them what were the problems and what was necessary, and then from that build a theoretical framework rather than saying here's all of our theory, now you conform to us. Trying to figure out what does meta leadership mean. So we have a whiteboard in our office, and Isaac goes up to the whiteboard and he draws a circle. He says it starts with the person of the leader. It starts with your emotional intelligence. It starts with your ability to get out of panic mode. And it sends us down to our primitive brain, what we call the basement. And when you are in the basement, you have only 3 potential responses. You will freeze, flight, you will run away, or you will fight. You will become very antagonistic. And so what we teach in that part of the curriculum is that we teach leaders, you will go to the basement in any kind of an event or before an event, even preparing for an event. And what you need to do is to get out of the basement. You get out of the basement by going to your toolbox. Your toolbox are those things that you've learned how to do. They come from the drills, the exercises, your experience. And then at the higher level of the brain is your laboratory. This is where we do our thinking and learning. So what we do is we teach leaders to go from the basement to the toolbox, reset your brain, and then get to the higher level where you're doing meta leadership. You're building unity of effort.